Hey guys, welcome back to the fanfic reread project. In today's episode, we are continuing our reread of Batman Begins, starting with a third-person chapter. It's not like I explained that last episode. It's no mystery. So I'm gonna dive right in because, like I said last episode, I kind of explained why this story has random, like, third-person omniscient, quote-unquote, chapters, while none of the other Batman stories do. But let's go. Deep in the southern part of Gotham City, in the eastern corner of the island, there was a place of almost eternal decay. Though decay is a word that can be used to describe quite a few corners of the city, but none were as dark as the abandoned Hurricane District. There were no streetlights here, there were no lights there natively at all, and darkness crouched in the corners of buildings of storm-battered bricks and broken steel. So, right away, this paragraph feels completely different from everything we've written so far. It is interesting that the rando third-person narrator seems to have a very clear character voice. I don't know if this continues to be a thing or if it's just this chapter, but I guess we'll see when we keep going. I don't hate this. By its very nature, the place inspired legends of ghosts whose garbled voice echoed through flooded halls, and monsters that swam under the decaying boards of the old docks waiting to snatch up the unwary in their clawed and clammy hands. But those were stories, tales children told to scare their younger siblings at night. In reality, all the old warehouse district was just that, old, abandoned, and a perfect place for the corrupt to do their dealings. Yeah, that sentence has, it says in reality, all the old warehouse district was just that. That doesn't really make sense. But anyway, deep in the district, on the last few dregs of land that were stable enough to hold anything, there was a place filled with old storage containers stacked as high as they could go. This is where Carmine Falcone conducted his own operations. He didn't have to hide himself like this. No one was going to stop him, but old habits died hard. Yeah, so far this feels completely like I feel like I'm reading a different book. What the fuck? Even outside of the writing style, I appreciate the level of world building that's happening here because this is something that's not in like the source material or any source material, I'm pretty sure. So this chapter actually taking the time to sort of give us a little bit of background on what this place is and all the legends and stuff, and the scene setting is really good. Like, it's kind of spoofy. I like it. What is this? Who wrote this? Why is this so wildly different from everything else? I feel like that's going to change once we get to later parts of this, but still, good god. He sat comfortably in his limousine as his men did all the heavy lifting. Falcone called the shots. He didn't make them, at least not most of the time. He mulled over the stuffed rabbit toy in his hands. He wasn't fond of them, or rather what they held. Flass, who had gone to see if things were running smoothly, had gotten back into the car at this point. "Everything looks fine out there," he said, closing the door behind him. He glanced down at the toy. "So the bears go straight to the dealers, and the rabbits go straight to our man in the Narrows," he finished. "Oh, what's the difference?" Flass asked, raising an eyebrow. "Ignorance is bliss," Falcone said with a small chuckle. "Don't burden yourself with the secrets of scary people." Flass chuckled nervously in return. In the containers, the men were getting down to the last few boxes. They walked carefully along the dark concrete. The few lights they brought were all they had, and even the smallest misstep would leave you on the wet pavement. One of them was carrying his to the large stack when he heard a garbled yell behind him. He turned, but all that met him was the open end of the trailer they were unloading. God, what brain? Please stop skipping words. He turned, but all that met him was the open end of the trailer they were unloading, its inside black as a void. But that wasn't right. Someone else was there when he'd left. Stice?" he called out, thinking that he'd just gone to get another box. He got no reply. Instantly, he dropped his box and drew his gun. Another man came up behind him and told him to come on, that they only had a few more to get, but he was cut short when the gun caught his eye. He drew his own, and slowly the duo moved toward the trailer. This is a bit random, but I feel like the part where it says he's cut short, it should have been he trailed off instead, because most people don't like go, "Oh man, we've only got a few more when they see something that is kind of like, unless it's like something that actually shocks them, and you just be like, "We got a few more boxes," like, this is again tiny little thing, it's like editing, but whatever. They'd gotten close enough to get a proper look inside when something shattered behind them. They both whipped around. One of the lamps had been broken, its glass left scattered across the ground. They glanced at each other nervously, then another lamp went out, falling off the container it was attached to with a crash, and then another, and another, until only two remained. When the last one died, they caught a flash of light. One of the men moved cautiously toward the broken lamp. In between the bits of white glass was a small piece of steel carved into the shape of a bat. He had begun to take it back to show his companion when he felt a small sting. The thing had sliced right into his palm. Light danced across the face as it fell to the ground, the blood dark red over the silver. He looked up to find his companion staring at the sky, a look of absolute horror upon his face. "What?" he asked, bewildered. When he didn't get a response, he looked up for himself, and then he was gone. The other man ran like he caught sight of the devil himself, and for all he knew, he damn well had. He raced through the containers, sliding around a corner on the wet pavement until the thing pulled him into the shadows, a single scream piercing the air. The rest of them had heard that loud and clear. They all became anxious then, creeping along with their firearms drawn and constantly looking over their shoulders. All right, so let me pause right there and say that, for the most part, what we've been reading has been pretty decent. It feels really weird to focus on these two men. Nameless as they are, it does feel like they are folks. So then to go to a group of basically faceless characters after that and then have to relate to their fear is kind of hard. I mean, yeah, this isn't bad so far. I don't like the writing in these action, quote unquote, action parts as much as I did some of the stuff we were reading earlier, but hey. Oh, also, this is a random thought, but the line where it says the other man ran like he caught sight of the devil himself, and for all he knew, he damn well had. It reminds me, even though this line did not influence this one, because number one, I wrote that later, and number two, I was not, like, consuming this media at the same time. But in Pirates of the Caribbean, there is a line where, and this is not Curse of the Black Pearl. This is Dead Man's Chest, which is, I wrote that years ago and then depublished it for reasons. But there's a line where Jack says something along the same lines as that, like, move as if the devil himself and itself is on our tails or whatever. And I don't know, that line just made me think of that randomly. But again, this didn't consciously inspire that because that line is directly from the movie it's based on. Anyway, Flass had heard it too. He approached them with a look of confusion on his face. "What the hell is going on?" One of the men turned. "I don't know, man. He was cut off by the sizzle and crack of a light bulb breaking. And there, too, the lamps went out until there were none. They wandered, virtually blind in the moonless night, reacting to even the smallest of sounds. One of the men had backed into the side of a container and managed to scare them all half to death as the resulting bang echoed through the dark." Okay, that's a run-on sentence I cannot abide by. So far, the run-ons in this haven't been too bad because they've at least used commas and stuff. But overall, this section does have still quite a few, as well as a lot of unnecessary semicolons attaching things that don't necessarily have to be attached. But moving on. "Where are you?" he yelled into the night in his frustration. "Where the hell are you?" "Here," a low voice whispered back, and then he disappeared into the dark. Flass ran back to the limousine and ripped the door open. "What the hell is going on?" Falcone asked, bewildered. "You've got a problem out there," Flass responded, a note of panic in his voice. "Bail." Before Falcone could say anything else, the door had slammed shut. That answer wasn't sufficient enough for him. He grabbed his shotgun from the floor and headed out the car. All hell had broken loose in the containers. The remaining men were thrown into a panic, firing in any direction, trying to hit the monster terrorizing them. A tall, black shape whizzed between them, twisting arms, breaking legs, and throwing men to the ground. When Falcone rounded the corner, he caught sight of the thing himself and stopped right in his tracks, and then turned and rushed back to his car. He threw himself into the back seat, banging against the partition. "Let's get out of here." Oh my god. I'm sorry. Reading that line fucking reminded me of a moment from a Game Grumps playthrough. If you just watch, like, any compilation of Zelda Wand of Gamelon, there's a moment where, like, these two, like, soldiers walk up to one of the dead bosses and see, like, his beating heart. and then Dan's like, "Let's get out of here." I accidentally mimicked that. God. Anyway. "Let's get out of here," he said, but he got no answer. As he looked closer through the tinted glass, he saw that his driver was slumped over on his side, unconscious. Okay, so question timing-wise, when did Batman find the time to do that? Did he do that first? And they never noticed? The timing here is a little bit off, but I think that's in the movie too, so I'm not sure. Suddenly the car rocked on its wheels as a loud thump sounded behind him. He clutched the shotgun in his hands as more thumps shook the limousine. Then it became silent. Slowly, carefully, he aimed the gun towards the window, ready to make a shot. "What the hell are you?" Falcone said in a low voice. He was showered with glass as a pitch-black hand grabbed him by the lapels and dragged him out through the broken sunroof. He was greeted by a terrifying creature, a man clad in so much black he looked like a shadow, like a bat, with ears pointed like a demon's horns and burning orange eyes set in a dark, menacing scowl. The voice that answered him was almost a growl. A Batman. I think that's the best Batman, quote-unquote, impression that I've done in any time I've read this. So let me pause there and say that, for what we've read so far, this is not terrible. It's not scary, but quite frankly, I don't think the original scene in the movie is scary either. That's just my opinion, though. So I think that's one thing that I feel like sometimes these stories sort of lack is moments where Batman is actually scary. So you see why criminals fear him so much outside of just getting the shit beat out of them. You can see that part pretty clearly. But as it goes with other stuff, it's kind of like, well, what is it about this guy that really gets to them, you know? It is so hard to read this without comparing him to Daredevil and Speak of the Devil, honestly, but that's not really fair because Matt's literally a vampire and so is naturally just scarier than Batman could ever even try to be. He's scarier than actual literal Daredevil from the TV show. But anyway, let's keep going because we're almost to the end of this chapter. It was only an hour or so before the police came, and none of them could really believe the scene laid out in front of them. Bloodied and battered men lay scattered across the ground in front of a container filled to the brim with boxes, a few of which that toppled over and spilled their contents. The media hounds couldn't get enough of it, so much that they'd even made the effort to come all the way out there. The yellow tape wasn't enough to keep them back. Jim made his way to the scene with a coffee cup in hand. If he was being honest, he didn't know who could have done something like this. Even the police hadn't been able to stop Falcone, not that a lot of them wanted to, and yet some guys were able to take down all of his men. He crouched down in front of one of them. He was unconscious and covered in bruises, his hands tied behind his back with a thick black rope. "Falcone's men?" someone asked behind him. Jim turned to find Officer Roberts behind him, a dark-skinned man of about 50. Jim shrugged. "We'll never tie him to it." Roberts frowned. "I wouldn't be too sure of that." Jim rose and followed his gaze. A single foggy harbor light was trained toward the sky. That was odd. He was almost certain most of the place had lost power ages ago. Jim looked back to Roberts, who just shrugged, and then they both started towards it. So here's the thing. From the looks of it in this story, Roberts is sort of Jim's partner. He shows up in another scene, and the fact that these two characters kind of keep ending up together at crime scenes, the implication is that they're partners. So, number one, why is Roberts not introduced with a first name? Number two, why is he an officer when Jim is a sergeant? Seems a little weird. But anyway, like I said, I didn't know anything about cop stuff back then. So, moving on. Other officers were already there when they arrived, and every single one of them was staring at it in shock. Carmine Falcone was chained to the surface of the light by his arms, babbling incoherently. His suit coat had been ripped so that it spread out under his arms, almost like wings. "What's up with that?" Jim asked, raising an eyebrow. Roberts tapped him on the shoulder and then pointed to the sky. Falcone's body obscured the beam of the light, casting a shadowy shape onto the rusty clouds. "They look like a bat to you, Jim?" He was quiet a moment, almost in shock. Then he turned back to Roberts. "Tell them to get him down." He looked down, thinking back to that fool who'd broke into his office. "Watch for my sign." So they were dealing with one man. He shook his head. That was impossible, he thought. It was impossible that one man who couldn't even jump the gap between the roof of the police station and the apartment building next door could do all this. And yet the words still echoed in his mind. He turned and began back into the containers, mulling over his thoughts. He stopped a moment, thinking that he'd seen something move in the shadows. He looked to the space between two of them, but... Two of the containers? Sure, whatever. But there was nothing there but darkness. He had started again when he heard something. He was in no mood for this. He looked up again, but this time a pair of orange eyes stared back at him from the dark space. Then they were gone. A chill ran down his spine. This place had always given him the creeps. And that is the end of that. I really like that end sentence. But this chapter is kind of like a roller coaster ride in terms of quality, I feel like. I think the beginning The first few paragraphs of it are easily the best parts. All of the stuff with like the world building is really, really good and literally feels like it was written much later than everything else. The rest of it reads like the typical shit from the rest of this. Overall, it's not bad though. It's definitely not bad. I will say that the back like third of this chapter I think shows off sort of the issue with Jim throughout this story, where he kind of just wanders through crime scenes instead of doing, again, any procedural stuff. It really starts to, like, not wear on you, but it really starts to sort of, like, fray the edges of the story when the rest of it works so well, I think. But yeah, anyway, that chapter was definitely not that bad. So moving on, we now move to a Rachel chapter. She didn't like riding the monorail like she used to. Over time, it had grown old and dingy, an attribute painfully accentuated by the bright fluorescent lights. The only improvement they'd bothered to make was replacing the speakers, and that was only because they'd stopped functioning properly. They put so little effort into keeping the thing running, it was actually astonishing. She wasn't the only one who thought so either. The train was empty save for one other person, a man sitting far on the other end of the car chattering quietly on his phone. Or maybe it was just the hour. You know what's funny? Not to bring up NJ Transit again. Welcome to the new me. But I vaguely remember writing a reference of, like, I don't remember what exact train it was referencing, but it referenced other public transportation. And I guess that's just not in here anymore. I guess I wrote that out years ago and never realized, but anyway. Rachel sighed and let her head rest against the window. The day had been long and frustrating. Dr. Crane came to testify again, and another one of Falcone's cronies had gotten sent to the asylum. She'd grown wary of the doctor over the last few months. He had been sending defendants away with unsettling delight. When she stopped to ask him about his diagnosis, he was practically beaming despite his seemingly deteriorating health. Carl had asked about Bruce again. He was the one who had mentioned that Bruce had come back to town, but over the last month or so she hadn't been able to get in touch with him. She meant to drop by at least once, but work kept her in the office later and later. She found it odd that he hadn't come to see her, though. He usually did. In college, when he came home for holidays, which was rare enough, he'd always stop by to see her and her mother, even if he was only there for a few days. Then again, 7 years was a long time, and only God knew where he'd gone off to then. She tried not to let it worry her. Maybe he was busy too. Ha ha, ha 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 ha. She still remembered the day he left, and she still couldn't quite believe it. She had thought that maybe he was dead. She hated herself for thinking that, but it was like he had disappeared off the face of the earth after that night. It took her a while to stop blaming herself for it. He was emotional, she would say to herself. I should have been more understanding, less blunt. But over time she realized that she didn't know what happened after she pulled off, and that he made his own choices, good or bad. Okay, so let's pause right there. Number one, pin the fact that Bruce apparently has not spoken to Rachel since he came back to town, and it's been, like, over a month. That's very important. I know I keep mentioning things about Rachel. This is, I think, the second time I've brought it up, something about their relationship. But we will get to talk about this in the ensuing chapters. Right now, it's a little bit too early to kind of dig into it. But, so, the other thing here, when Rachel is talking about, like, well, he made his own choices, you know? Back when I wrote this, I agreed with what she was saying here, that, like, you know, for a while she blamed herself, but over time she really came to believe that, you know, like, what he did is what he did, and after I let him out of the car, it's not really my fault. But here's the thing. Bruce is non-binary, and in this story it's not as clear, but in The Dark Knight Rises it is a little bit more explicit, but very much, it's like very obvious that he's non-binary, and you let him off in like the depths of who God knows where part of Gotham City, in the middle of the fucking night, or at night, I should say. It wasn't the middle of the night, but at night, in front of a club owned by an Italian mob boss. And then you're like, well, what he did was what he did. It's like, that doesn't really, like, looking back on it, this kind of doesn't make sense. Is it Rachel's fault that Bruce disappeared? Not really, because I guess he didn't have to get out of the car. But the fact of the matter is that that scene kind of doesn't make as much sense when Bruce is not, you know, Christian fucking Bale. It is a little bit kind of like, Rachel's like, well, you know, it's not really my fault, but it kind of, like, is. I don't know. It's a complicated situation, but it is a little bit suspect. And, like, here's the thing. What happened that night and the fact that she kind of blew up at him, and it makes sense that, like, all of the yelling and shit happened, but that one specific moment is kind of like, really, though? But, anyway, let's move on. The train pulled into the station and came to a creaking halt. Rachel cringed as the rest of the lights flickered on. She pulled herself to her feet with a sigh and slipped out through the doors. As she walked down to the parking lot, she became aware of the sound of another pair of feet behind her. It was just the man who was on the train with her, but she kept a tight hand on her purse out of instinct. She started down the last flight of stairs when another man appeared at the bottom. She slowed as he started up the stairs toward her, eventually blocking her path. "Excuse me," she said, stepping to the side to walk around him, giving him the benefit of the doubt, but he stepped right back in front of her. Her jaw tightened. He pushed her back onto the landing, and a smile spread across his face. "Word on the street is that Falcone's got a beef with someone down in the DA's office." She felt herself back into the other man and whipped around, looking between the two of them in disgust. "He's offering a price to anyone who will do something about it." She rolled her eyes. "Is that so?" His smile faltered. "Lot of mouth for a little girl." "Well, who were you expecting?" she said, looking incredulously over her shoulder at the man behind her. He frowned. He tried to grab on her arm, but she whipped around and smacked him with her purse. The other man went to grab her too, but she spun back around, a taser in her hand. "Hold it!" The man stopped, considering the weapon in her hand. Her eyes narrowed, daring him to make his next move. He looked back up at her and scowled, but his eyes went wide. He staggered backward and then bolted down the stairs. Now she was the one smiling. "That's right," she yelled after him. "You better run." She whirled around, ready to deal with the other one now, and jumped back, slamming into the railing in shock. The other man was gone. Instead, a black figure was perched on the opposite railing, looking like a giant bat with its wings wrapped around itself. Her hand shot out and she fired her taser on impulse. It didn't even affect him. He pulled the darts from his chest, the weapon flying from her hands in the process. He coiled the wires and tossed it back to her. She just barely caught it. "Try mace," he said in a low growl. She nodded warily. "Falcone sent them to kill you." She hastily stuffed the taser back into her bag. "I know." "You rattled his cage." She shrugged. He nodded to something on the ground. "Oh, what are those?" she asked. "Leverage." "For what?" "To get things moving." She finally looked down. A pile of photos lay there. The top one showed Judge Faden entering a car with a girl. "Who are you?" she said, absolutely confused. "Someone like you. Someone who will rattle the cages." She bent down and picked them up. They were all of Faden, him exiting Falcone's nightclub, entering cars with other girls. All of his vices were covered. How in the world could someone have gotten a hold of something like this? She looked up to ask him just that, but he was gone. And I am going to, that is the end of the chapter. I'm not going to stop the episode here. But something that always confuses me about that last part is the fact that there are all these pictures of Judge Faden with all these girls, and I never understand how that is at all relevant to this case. Like, I would think that the pictures of him coming and going from what is very well known to be Falcone's little spot would be a lot more important than, oh, look, he's getting in a car with a girl. Like, you can't get him, like, indicted for cheating on his wife. Not to mention that there are probably pictures of him leaving the nightclub with the girls if they're trying to turn his wife against him or whatever, if he's even married. Again, I just don't understand how that's relevant. But anyway, that chapter was, it was interesting. It was short, but I think it's, like, short in a way that it did what it needed to do. Anyway, I liked the way that Rachel spent time thinking about some of the shit that's been going on. That part actually read pretty well. In particular, I kind of like the stuff about Crane. You know what, one thing I've been thinking about with this story is that I really wanted to revisit the Dr. Crane plot and see how that actually plays out and whether it plays as well as it did the last time I read this. So far, for what this story has had to do, I don't mind it at all. But yeah, that chapter wasn't bad. So moving on, we are coming back to Bruce now. The antics in the containers had left Bruce dead tired. He had arrived home in the dark, but he'd still pulled all of the curtains closed when he made it back to his room. He slept more soundly than he ever had, until the sun suddenly flooded the room and violently assaulted his eyes. "Bats are nocturnal," he snarled, pulling the duvet over his head. "Bats, maybe," Alfred replied as he set a tray on the bedside table, "but even for billionaire playboys, 3 o'clock is pushing it. Price of leading a double life, I fear." Bruce sat up, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. He made a mental note to pull out the heavy tapestry curtains later. Your theatrics made an impression, Alfred said, indicating a newspaper on the nightstand. A large picture filled most of the front page, Falcone strapped to the harbor light. Theatricality and deception are powerful weapons. It's a start. He took the cup of water from the tray and downed it all at once. In the light, Bruce saw that his arm was covered with bruises. So let me pause right here. One thing I've noticed that this story does quite a bit is that it'll say suddenly this, that, and the other on a thing where you could have conveyed the suddenness in other ways. One thing that I don't want to say taught, but a thing that I've kind of picked up over the years from writing is that you're really not supposed to use the word sudden all that often. I won't say not supposed to, because everyone's writing advice conflicts with everyone else's writing advice. But the thing here is that 9 times out of 10 when you say suddenly, you can convey the suddenness in another way. So it's just an unnecessary word. Again, I wrote this in 2013, so it does not surprise me that I wasn't doing that. Alfred noticed, too. If those are to be the first of many injuries, it would be wise to find a suitable excuse. Polo, for instance. I'm not learning polo, Alfred, Bruce scoffed. But those kinds of things beg the question of what exactly Bruce Wayne does with his time and his money. Just say he's into BDSM, I don't know. There are other things that you can... I mean, number one, Bruce has been walking around telling fucking Lucius Fox that he's been base jumping and spelunking, so it's really not that weird. Like, he could just stick to that. But anyway, he thought it was too much to process first thing in the morning. Well, afternoon, but Alfred had a point. After all the grief he gave him about being declared dead, he hadn't exactly made an effort to tell anyone he'd come back. Jesus. Eventually, the news reached the media after he'd gone to Wayne Tower, but he still spent most of his days in the house. His friends were threatening to come to town and drag him out of the house, and he hadn't even spoken to Rachel yet. But what does someone like me even do? He asked. Alfred shrugged. Drive nice cars, date movie stars, buy things that aren't for sale. He moved to the door. Who knows, Master Wayne? If you start pretending to have fun, you might even have a little by accident. He sat in his bed for a while, thinking. He didn't know how well he could fall into that routine. He was so busy with other things now. Spending his money for no reason seemed silly, even though he knew he could, and the thought of using people as accessories made him uncomfortable. I agree with half that sentence. Spending his money for no reason. I guess, what reasons, though, is he spending his money on right now, you know? You're a billionaire. You can spend your money for no reason and for reasons, and you would still be pretty fucking rich. Anyway... But it wasn't for real, he reminded himself. He didn't actually have to be that guy, quote-unquote. He just had to appear to be. A double life was one thing, but a triple life? It made him exhausted just thinking about it. But he could manage it, he thought as he got out of bed. He'd seen Tony do it 1,000,000 times. So this is what I meant. That's the end of the chapter, by the way. But this is what I was talking about when I said that international Playboy line in the second flashback chapter doesn't make sense, because the whole Playboy thing doesn't really occur to Bruce until this chapter. And I know, again, the dialogue in this chapter is taken directly out of the script and by extension the movie. But again, the fact that Bruce doesn't really sit down and think about, oh, well, maybe I could do this, unless he was joking. But even then, again, that line doesn't really make sense. One thing I'll say about Batman Begins is that it didn't go through the same deep editing process that I did for parts of The Dark Knight Rises back in the day. So it kind of feels incongruous with that story in particular. The Dark Knight, I never edited. I think I was just going to get around to it after I finished the other two things, because they're both infinitely longer. There are parts of this that feel out of step. So certain things when Bruce Wayne's like, I don't have to be that guy. And like, yeah, he does the billionaire Playboy thing later, but he does it differently because he's not, a guy at all. It's kind of weird. But and that chapter wasn't bad. It was kind of short. There was a time where this chapter and the chapter following it were actually connected, and I kind of feel like that should still be a thing. I don't know why I disconnect. I think it's just because it made the other, the combined chapter was really long, but I don't think I would have minded all that much. Anyway, moving on. Downtown Gotham sparkled like a jewel as the shining skyscrapers reached up into the purple glowing sky. The lights reflected off of the hood of his new car as he sped down the streets. He thought that normally he would have been opposed to dropping close to $300,000 on a car, but it was a nice car. A sleek Lamborghini Mercedes... Oh, God, forgive me if I pronounce this wrong. A sleek Lamborghini Murcielago, and it even came in black. Why does that say life? What? When he pulled up to the hotel, the valet scrambled to open the doors for him, and they were shocked in the silence when they realized who was in it. "A nice car," one of them managed to spit out. "You should see my other one," Bruce answered with a smirk. He walked to the other side and helped his date out of the car. "Shall we?" he said, giving her his hand. She smiled. So, pause. Again, I find it kind of weird, and I know I understand that it's because Bruce is, and this is kind of an interesting bit, the way that Bruce and Tony are opposed and the way that they are billionaires. But Bruce's oppositions and, like, his reluctance to spend his money is always kind of bizarre to me because he is so rich. Is it like a morality thing? Like, this much money on a car? Like, it's like when you say to your friends, like, if I get rich, I'm not going to buy a big mansion because I don't need all of that, like that sort of thing, because it's like a waste. I never get it. But anyway, they strode in through the large glass doors and were enveloped in silver. It covered the sparkling walls, and flecks of it glimmered in the black marble floors. Enormous chandeliers hung from the ceiling with glittering crystal dripping from each of the many slender arms. He heard Brianna let out a little gasp when she saw it all. She was tiny, at least a foot shorter than he was, even though she was wearing towering heels, though he was too. And her braids were the same shade of red as her shoes. Her brown skin seemed to glow under the lights. He could feel the people staring at them as he spoke to one of the hostesses, and was patently ignoring them until he saw someone waving at him out of the corner of his eye. Mrs. Evans gestured excitedly toward him from a table at the back of the room behind a beautiful fountain. When he reached the table, he saw that Mr. Earl was there too, along with a man he didn't recognize who had his arm around a woman at least half his age. "Bruce," she said with a smile, "it's so good to see you." "I know." She got up from her seat and threw her arms around his neck. "Oh, I've missed you." Dinner was absolutely divine. Oh, great. Brianna was on her fourth plate, ordering enthusiastically after Bruce assured her that they could have what they wanted and that there was no limit. Empty bottles of wine and stemmed glasses littered the entire table. Once talk turned back to the Batman, it had stayed there for the rest of the night. "At least he's getting something done," Mrs. Evans argued. That man, Mr. Taylor, leaned forward from his date, who'd been introduced to him as Tatiana, and said, "Bruce, help me out here." "A guy who dresses up like a bat clearly has issues," he answered matter-of-factly. "I don't know," or excuse me. There's too many characters in the scene, Jesus. "I don't know, Mr. Wayne," Brianna said, dabbing her mouth with a napkin. "He did put the Roman behind bars." Mrs. Evans nodded in agreement. "And now the cops are trying to bring him in," Mr. Earl said. "What does that tell you?" Brianna shrugged. "They're jealous?" Mrs. Evans leaned forward. "I think he deserves a medal." "Well, I think he's a damn fool," Mr. Earl scoffed. Excuse me, sir," someone said behind them. He turned to find the maitre d' standing there with a look of disapproval on his face. "The pool is for decoration, and your friend does not have swimwear." He looked toward the fountain and saw Tatiana splashing playfully in the water, her sparkling dress and shoes lying on the floor. Mr. Taylor waved at him dismissively. "She's European," he said with a laugh. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the maitre d' said. Bruce responded by pulling out his checkbook. He sighed. "It's not a question of money, sir." Bruce put up a hand. "No, you see, I'm buying this hotel," he said as he tucked the check into the man's pocket, "and I'm making some new rules for the pool area." The man stared at him and then hurried away as Mr. Taylor let out a laugh behind him. He stepped out of his shoes and followed Tatiana's lead. Jesus Christ. I mean, this scene is almost exactly the same way it is in the movie. For some reason, the prose is kind of bothering me. Like, did you hear the part where I was just like, "Dinner was divine," and I was just like, ugh. I don't even know why that bothered me, but it sure did. But anyway, moving on. When they left, he had on a white terry cloth robe instead of his jacket, which was draped over Brianna's shoulders. Tatiana was laughing raucously as she draped herself over Mr. Taylor. The valet pulled up his car first, and Brianna jumped in as soon as it came to a stop. "Bruce?" He looked up to find Rachel in front of him in a little black dress, with a sparkling shawl thrown over her shoulders. She looked beautiful. "I'd heard you were back," she continued. "My mother's been asking about you." She trailed off when she finally noticed his dripping wet dress. "Oh, what were you doing?" He looked down, just, swimming. She looked him up and down. "You were gone a long time." He nodded. "I know. How are things?" She shrugged. "The same. The job's been getting worse." "Can't save the world on your own," he said with a shrug of his own. "What choice do I have? You're too busy swimming." "Come on, Mr. Wayne," Brianna suddenly yelled from the car. "I got some more hotels I want you to buy." Rachel raised an eyebrow. He bit his lip. "Rachel, all this isn't me. I know, but do they know that? She said, jerking her head lightly toward the car. She left them with that, moving into the restaurant behind him. He could see Brianna watching him from the car, looking a bit confused. That's the end of that chapter. One thing I always find interesting about this scene is that Rachel comes and she, like, sees Bruce and is like, oh, you've been swimming. And it's not like, wow, he sure has changed, but is like, man, I can't believe you're not doing anything to help me take down criminals, you person who has absolutely no hand in the justice system. What? Anyway, this chapter was fine. I don't have any strong feelings toward or against it. I kind of like Brianna. I won't say pin her, but she does show up again in the story. I won't say she pushes forward any plots or anything, but she is vaguely important. But anyway, I just feel like there could have been another way to convey Rachel's disapproval of what it seems to be transpiring here that doesn't immediately go to her being like, wow, you sure are squandering everything, doing weird stuff, as if this is something Bruce has been doing his entire life. But anyway, did you notice there? I actually changed one of Rachel's lines where she says, the part where Bruce is like, oh, this isn't me. And she's like, but do they know that? And in the actual movie, she says that line that's like, it's not what you are, but it's what you do that defines you. And I was just like, no one talks like that. So I changed her line. The actual line does come up later in the story. You'll see how toward the end. But I actually think this one works really well because it makes more sense that she's like, okay, but do these people know that this isn't who you are, really? Instead of being like, it's not your insides, but your outsides in some weird informal way. But anyway, moving on. I think this is going to be the last chapter I read for this. Yeah. Jimmy was telling Kitty his stories again. He was quite the storyteller for a boy his age, which only worked to worry them on the off chance he'd give his sister nightmares. It was the ones like the one he was telling right now, one about a giant bat, that really got him. He watched as the boy put his arms out and mimicked the creature's flapping wings. He was so into it that he left his carrots untouched on the plate. Jimmy, he said, patting him on the shoulder, don't forget to finish your dinner. I will, Dad, he said, but he didn't touch them. Have you seen him, Dad? Saw who? The Batman? Jim shrugged. Maybe. Kitty leaned forward in her booster seat. You saw the bat, Daddy? Tell us, Jimmy said. He was practically hopping in his seat. His sister joined in with him. Tell us, tell us. Behind them, Barbara had turned from the sink. Oh, sorry. I love Jim Gordon's kids, and I'm sad that they don't show up more in the series at all. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Calm down a minute. I'll tell you about them. Their faces lit up. When you finish your dinner. Jimmy sat back in his seat, defeated. Kitty crossed her arms and poked out her lips. Barbara leaned over his shoulder. Can you take out the trash, Jim? I'll take care of them, she said, flicking her eyes in their direction. Yeah, of course, he said, rising. He grabbed the bag and pulled on his coat. He turned to his children. Those better be gone when I get back. The air outside was humid, but the coolness made it more bearable than when it was like this in the summer. The sky was heavy with clouds that glowed orange from the city lights. Maybe it'll snow, he thought as he jogged down the stairs and threw the bag into one of the garbage cans. But then a bolt of lightning flashed in between the clouds, momentarily turning them bright blue-white. Why is that one sentence? That was odd, he thought. Lightning in February? Storm's coming. He spun around and found the Batman staring back at him from the fire escape above him. He almost looked like a shadow from there, with his cape pulled around him. His eyes stood out in the dark. Jim took a deep breath to calm his nerves. Scum's getting jumpy because you stood up to Falcone, he said to him. To start. Your partner was at the docks, Batman informed him. Gordon shrugged. It didn't surprise him. He moonlights as a low-level enforcer. They were splitting the shipments. Only half was going to the dealers. That, on the other hand, did. Why? What about the other ones? Flass knows. He won't talk, Jim said with a shake of the head. Batman narrowed his eyes. He'll talk to me. The way he snarled it sent a chill down his spine. Commissioner Loeb set up a massive task force to catch you, he said, though there was no way he couldn't know. He thinks you're dangerous. What do you think? Jim looked down. I think you're trying to help. When he looked back up, Batman had disappeared. He sighed. But I've been wrong before. Alright, we're gonna, stop there. This does lead into the next chapter. Well, actually, no, it doesn't. I lied. Not directly, anyway. Not anymore. But, yeah, so that chapter was fine. It was incredibly short. I wish it wasn't. This is the other Jim chapter that I actually kind of like, because getting to see like his home life and his family is really interesting. His kids are hilarious. And just in general, it tells us a little bit more about the character. And anytime Jim is not doing police stuff are chapters where Jim's content is actually pretty decent. But yeah, again, this chapter was way too short. I said I was going to not give any more overall things because that kind of doesn't make sense anymore. But I think the quality of these chapters wasn't as up and down as it usually is. I think overall I tended to like these a bit more, barring the 2 Bruce chapters that we read, which I'm kind of about. But yeah, what we read today wasn't bad. So next episode, we are going to be reading another one of those third-person chapters. I think there are 3 throughout the entire piece. So that means we are going to be seeing Batman once again. If you like this video and you like this reread, don't forget to like it or favorite. Oh god. Anyway, also subscribe if you want to see more of this stuff or check out the backlog and stuff. And I will see you next episode. Bye.